There are moments in life when words, spoken carelessly, become more than just sound waves dissipating into the air. They become catalysts for consequences no one saw coming. For Greg Lawson, a renowned television host known for his biting critiques and sharp-tongued analysis, it was just another night on air. Another evening where he prided himself on dissecting political figures with the precision of a seasoned debater, his voice slicing through arguments with the ease of a scalpel. But tonight, he would go too far. The cityscape shimmered beyond the studio's wide glass windows, a sea of twinkling lights stretching endlessly into the darkness. Inside, the air was crisp, thick with the quiet intensity of live television. The broadcast was already well into its second segment, the control room humming with the rhythmic blips of soundboards and flashing monitors. The crew barely acknowledged the words tumbling from Greg's mouth, until one particular comment sent a ripple through the air, like a stone disrupting still water. Pam Bondi's name had surfaced, as it often did when discussions veered toward legal battles and political debates. Her tenure as Florida's Attorney General had been defined by fierce legal fights, unshakable convictions, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She had been scrutinized, praised, and at times vilified, but nothing could have prepared her, or Greg, for what was about to happen. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. A casual mockery, a dismissive smirk, a comment that, in another era, might have been brushed off as just another heated jab in the relentless world of political discourse. But this wasn't another era. This was now, a time when words carried weight, when a single statement could set fire to reputations, careers, entire networks. The silence in the control room was deafening. Greg, oblivious to the shift in the air, continued speaking, leaning back into his chair with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. But even as the words left his lips, something began to stir beyond the studio walls. It started as a whisper in the depths of social media, a few comments, a handful of shares. And then, like gasoline meeting flame, it erupted. Pam Bondi had never been one to respond impulsively. She was measured, deliberate. But when she saw the clip circulating, dissected and replayed from every angle, something inside her stilled. She had faced public criticism before, endured the barbs of political adversaries, but this was different. It wasn't an attack on policy or decisions. It was personal, and that, she knew, would have far greater repercussions than Greg Lawson had anticipated. The calls began within the hour. Network executives, advertisers, colleagues who had once been Greg's allies now distanced themselves, their voices tight with carefully curated neutrality. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the world he operated in. And now, as the lights dimmed in the emptying newsroom and the city hummed on outside, Greg Lawson sat alone at his desk, scrolling through the endless barrage of messages flooding his phone. Something had shifted, and for the first time in years, the man who had built his career on tearing others apart felt the sharp sting of words coming back to haunt him. The air in Greg Lawson's office had taken on a stifling quality, thick with an anxiety he had never quite known before. He sat motionless, his fingers hovering above his phone screen, scrolling through an unrelenting stream of messages that seemed to arrive faster than he could process them. Each notification carried a new variation of the same unsettling truth. He had not merely angered a vocal minority. He had unleashed something far larger, something he could no longer control. The words he had spoken just hours before, words that had come so effortlessly from his lips, now felt like sharp-edged stones pressing against his chest. He had underestimated the gravity of his own voice, the weight it carried when broadcast across millions of screens. It had never occurred to him that an offhand remark, laced with a smirk and casual derision, could shake the very foundation of his career. He had thrived on controversy, built his reputation on dismantling public figures with precise, calculated rhetoric. Yet this time, the tables had turned. Pam Bondi had not responded with outrage or condemnation, had not fueled the fire with reactionary indignation. Instead, she had remained quiet, her silence speaking louder than any carefully crafted statement ever could. The public had filled in the gaps, interpreting her lack of response as something far more powerful than rebuttal. People were not just angered by what had been said. They were angered by what it represented, a growing disregard for dignity, for professionalism, for the very values Greg had once claimed to champion. By the time Greg arrived at the network headquarters the next morning, the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Colleagues who had once greeted him with nods of respect now averted their gazes. Their interactions clipped, their conversations whispered in cautious tones. He moved through the halls with a growing sense of unease, the usual hum of the newsroom feeling distant, as though he were walking through a place that no longer belonged to him. His producer, a man whose trust Greg had earned through years of successful broadcasts, met him outside his office with an expression that confirmed what Greg already feared. The network had received calls, hundreds of them. Sponsors were reconsidering their partnerships. Audiences were threatening boycotts, and industry figures who had once defended Greg's brash style were now retreating into the shadows, unwilling to be collateral damage in his downfall. The meeting that followed was swift, clinical. Executives sat with their hands folded, their faces set in the unreadable expressions of individuals accustomed to making ruthless decisions. Words like damage control and corporate responsibility filled the air, but Greg barely processed them, his mind stuck on the stark reality settling before him. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability. When the final verdict came, it arrived without theatrics, without raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. His contract would be terminated effective immediately. The show that bore his name, the platform he had cultivated over years of relentless work, would go on without him. Greg had always envisioned himself as untouchable, as someone too valuable to discard, too essential to be erased. But in that moment, sitting across from executives who had once courted him for his boldness, he realized just how replaceable he truly was. As he walked out of the network building, past cameras waiting to capture the fall of a man who had built his career on scrutinizing others, Greg found himself overwhelmed by a singular, piercing thought. He had spent years believing words were weapons to be wielded at will, failing to recognize that the sharpest blades cut both ways. The storm of controversy had gathered momentum with an intensity that few had predicted, its reach expanding beyond the realm of politics and into the broader discourse of media ethics and personal accountability. Greg Lawson's dismissal, while swift, had not ended the conversation. It had only deepened it. News segments dissected the fallout, opinion columns debated the implications, and social media churned with ceaseless arguments over whether the consequences had been justified or excessive. Yet, amid the cacophony of voices, one person remained conspicuously silent. Pam Bondi had not issued statements of condemnation, had not granted interviews, had not engaged in the spectacle of public retaliation. Instead, she had carried on with her work, her demeanor as composed and resolute as ever, as if the controversy surrounding her name had done nothing to disrupt the course of her life. But beneath her measured exterior, she had given the situation considerable thought, not because she sought retribution, but because she understood the deeper significance of what had transpired. She had seen the footage, had watched the now infamous moment replayed endlessly across every conceivable platform. The mockery itself had not surprised her. She was no stranger to public scrutiny, to the sharp tongues of those who disagreed with her. What had struck her, however, was the way the moment had spiraled beyond Greg Lawson's control, the way his words had unraveled not just his own career, but the trust that many had placed in him. It was not the insult that had doomed him. It was the casual cruelty of it, the ease with which he had assumed his words would carry no weight beyond the fleeting moment of delivery. In the days following Greg's dismissal, invitations had poured in for her to comment, to take a victory lap in the face of his downfall. Networks sought exclusive interviews, columnists pressed for statements, political figures urged her to seize the moment. But she had no interest in engaging with the spectacle, no desire to reduce the matter to a partisan battle. To her, this was not about a personal affront. It was about something much larger, something that extended beyond herself or even Greg Lawson. She had spent her career in the legal world, had stood in courtrooms where words shaped destinies, where the power of language could exonerate or condemn. She understood the weight of public discourse, the responsibility that came with a platform. And as she watched the world argue over whether Greg's punishment had been too severe or entirely deserved, she saw in it a reflection of a deeper societal reckoning. A moment when people were forced to confront not just the power of speech, but the cost of recklessness. One evening, nearly a week after the controversy had reached its peak, Pam sat before her desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She had ignored the calls for interviews, had declined every invitation to speak on the matter, but something inside her told her that silence, while powerful, was not enough. She did not wish to fuel outrage, nor did she wish to gloat, but she knew that this was an opportunity to say something that mattered, something that could shift the conversation towards something more meaningful. Her pen moved slowly at first, each word chosen with the deliberation of someone who understood their weight. She did not write about Greg Lawson or his fall from grace. She did not address the insult or the mockery. Instead, she wrote about the responsibility of words, about the necessity of discourse that did not seek to destroy but to challenge with integrity. She wrote about the erosion of dignity in modern debate, the way personal attacks had replaced substantive disagreements, the way society had grown too comfortable with the idea that cruelty was entertainment. By the time she finished, the letter was not a condemnation, nor was it an appeal for sympathy. It was a reflection, a call to accountability, not just for those in media, but for everyone who engaged in public dialogue. She read it twice before folding the paper neatly and slipping it into an envelope, knowing that it would soon find its way into the world, that it would add another voice to the conversation, one that did not seek to punish but to remind. Meanwhile, Greg Lawson sat in the quiet of his now-empty home office, scrolling through headlines that no longer bore his name with the same fervor they once had. The world had already begun moving on, as it always did, the cycle of outrage shifting to newer targets, fresher controversies. But he knew that the impact of his words, the recklessness of that singular moment, would follow him for far longer than the headlines ever would. And as the first copies of Pam Bondi's letter were published, as the words she had carefully chosen found their way into the hands of the public, Greg read them in silence, his expression unreadable. They did not defend him, nor did they condemn him, but they forced him, perhaps for the first time in his life, to truly listen. The morning sun cast long golden streaks across the city skyline, illuminating the glass facades of towering buildings that housed the nation's most powerful voices. Among them, the newsroom where Greg Lawson had once ruled the airwaves sat quieter than usual, its halls now devoid of the presence that had once dictated the tempo of heated political debate. The remnants of his career lingered in half-empty offices and hastily reassigned time slots. But the conversation surrounding him had taken a life of its own, moving beyond his actions and into a broader discourse about the nature of speech, responsibility, and consequence. Pam Bondi's letter had landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling outward in ways no one had quite anticipated. The media had expected outrage, a sharp rebuke laced with righteous indignation, a demand for retribution wrapped in the polished language of political retaliation. Instead, what she had offered was something far more measured, far more piercing, a reflection not just on the moment itself, but on the culture that had allowed it to happen. Her words had not defended Greg, nor had they sought to justify the backlash he had faced. Instead, they had turned the spotlight away from him entirely, directing it instead toward the uncomfortable reality of modern discourse. She had written about the slow erosion of dignity in public debate, about the way conversations had ceased to be about ideas and had instead become battlegrounds where reputations were destroyed for entertainment. She had questioned whether accountability had become synonymous with destruction, whether people were more eager to witness a downfall than to engage in meaningful dialogue. The response had been immediate and deeply divided. Some praised her restraint, applauding her for refusing to contribute to the cycle of outrage that had consumed so many public figures before her. Others saw her measured tone as an act of weakness, arguing that someone in her position should have used the moment to dismantle Greg Lawson in the same way he had attempted to dismantle her. Yet, the one reaction no one had anticipated was that of Greg himself. For days, he had remained hidden from the public eye, a man once synonymous with fiery rhetoric now reduced to the quietest figure in the very discourse he had dominated. The weight of his words, once wielded so carelessly, had settled on him with a heaviness he had never known before. He had watched as former colleagues distanced themselves, as industry insiders speculated on whether his career was salvageable, as social media tore apart his every past remark in search of a pattern that would justify his permanent exile. But it was Pam Bondi's letter that had unsettled him the most. He had expected condemnation, had braced himself for the kind of blistering rebuttal he had so often delivered himself. Instead, he had been met with something far more disarming, a challenge not to defend himself, not to beg for forgiveness, but to truly reckon with the choices that had led him to this moment. For the first time in years, Greg found himself at a loss for words. Elsewhere, the public's reaction to Pam's response continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The conversation had shifted, no longer centered on Greg alone, but expanding into something broader, something far more uncomfortable to ignore. Other figures in media began weighing in, some acknowledging their own roles in the degradation of public discourse, others pushing back against the notion that restraint was a virtue in a time of political warfare. Talk shows debated whether Greg's punishment had been justified or excessive. Columnists dissected the cultural implications of what had transpired. Ordinary people took to social media, some reflecting on their own tendencies to indulge in public shaming, others defending the need to hold powerful voices accountable for their words. The network that had once been Greg's home, now eager to distance itself from the controversy, attempted to pivot. They brought in a new host, someone younger, someone untainted by scandal, someone who could restore their credibility. Yet, as the ratings began to dip, as longtime viewers expressed their discomfort with the way Greg had been cast aside, executives realized they had miscalculated. The audience had not been looking for a fresh face. They had been looking for resolution, for something that felt complete. It was then, in the quiet of his self-imposed exile, that Greg made a decision no one had expected. He had spent years crafting an image of himself as a man unbothered by criticism, a voice immune to consequence. Yet, for the first time, he recognized the hollowness of that illusion. He had assumed that power lay in the ability to speak without fear, to wield words like weapons without considering their impact. But as he stared at the walls of a career that had collapsed around him, he understood that power was something else entirely. Power was in knowing when to speak and when to listen. And for the first time in his life, Greg Lawson was finally ready to listen. Greg Lawson had always believed in the power of speech, the undeniable force of well-crafted words, the ability to control a room through sheer rhetorical command. He had built his career on that belief, had thrived in an industry that rewarded sharp tongues and relentless conviction. But in the days following his downfall, as he sat alone in the quiet of a life suddenly stripped of purpose, he began to grasp a truth he had never before considered. Sometimes, silence held more weight than any statement ever could. Pam Bondi's letter had unsettled him in ways he could not yet articulate. It had not condemned him, had not excused him, had not even directly acknowledged him beyond the broader conversation his words had ignited. Instead, it had forced him to look inward, to sit with the consequences of his own recklessness, to recognize that the damage he had caused was not merely professional, but personal, not just to others, but to himself. For the first time in years, Greg was unsure of his next move. He had spent so long reacting, analyzing, countering, dismantling, that the idea of simply being, of allowing the world to turn without his voice in it, felt foreign, almost unbearable. But the more he resisted, the more he realized that his greatest mistake had never been the words he had spoken in that fateful broadcast. His greatest mistake had been in assuming that he would never be forced to confront what lay beneath him. The world, meanwhile, had already begun to shift. The media frenzy surrounding his downfall had slowed, its energy redirected toward new scandals, fresh controversies, different names now occupying the headlines. His absence from the airwaves had created a void, one that his network had been eager to fill, yet something had changed within the audience itself. The discussions that had once thrived on outrage now carried an air of exhaustion, as if people had finally begun to question whether they had been complicit in a system that thrived on destruction. Pam Bondi, for her part, had moved on. She had never intended for her words to linger in the public consciousness for long, nor had she sought to define Greg's legacy through the lens of a single moment. She had said what she needed to say, had planted the seed of introspection where there had once been only division, and now she continued forward, unaffected by the noise left in her wake. But Greg could not move on so easily. He could not ignore the weight of what had transpired, could not shake the knowledge that the world had changed around him in ways he had failed to anticipate. And so, after weeks of silence, he did something no one expected. He spoke, not through a carefully orchestrated television appearance, not through a publicist-approved press release, not through a desperate attempt to reclaim relevance. He simply wrote. His words, once weapons wielded for effect, now carried a different energy, one stripped of arrogance, one absent of performance, one that felt, for the first time, genuine. I spent years believing that my voice was my greatest asset, that my ability to dismantle others with words made me untouchable. I thought intelligence was measured in how quickly I could expose weakness, how effectively I could challenge, how powerfully I could assert my own position. But I never stopped to consider the weight of what I was building, never questioned whether my words were creating something lasting or simply reducing everything around me to rubble. I do not write this to ask for forgiveness. I do not write this to seek redemption. I write this because, for the first time, I understand what I refused to acknowledge for so long. Speech is not just about what we say. It is about what we choose not to say, about the moments when restraint speaks louder than rhetoric, when listening holds more value than responding. Pam Bondi did not condemn me. She did not call for my destruction. Instead, she forced me to see myself as I truly am, not as I wish to be perceived, but as I had allowed myself to become. I have spent my life talking. For now, I think I need to learn how to listen. The response to his letter was unlike anything he had ever experienced. There were those who dismissed it as performative, those who remained unmoved, those who had no interest in redemption. But there were also those who saw something different, an acknowledgement not of victimhood, but of responsibility, a recognition that true accountability was not about making amends through spectacle, but about changing in the quiet spaces where no one was watching. Greg Lawson would never return to the pedestal he had once occupied. His voice, once dominant, would never again command the same authority. But as he watched the world respond to his words in ways he had never expected, he realized something strange, something almost poetic. For the first time in his life, Greg Lawson was truly being heard. And for the first time, he understood why.